Welcome back to Casted, our podcast here at ITU, where we try to talk about popular science issues related to the foundations of IT. My name is Tore Husfeldt, I'm your host, and our guest today is Espen Aarseth, who is a professor here at ITU, a professor of game study. Espen, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
So, game study, tell us what that is.
Right.
What it isn't is.
Yes, game studies, that is a field, an interdisciplinary field of research that looks at games from a fair amount of angles. So it could be a humanistic focus, it could be a pedagogical focus, it could be a design focus, it could be a social science focus, perhaps psychology is involved. There are, of course, also things outside of game studies. I'm happy to report people who are looking at games but would not see themselves as doing game studies. But they would find interesting things in the field or phenomena of games, which they would study from some other angle.
So let me go in there already. So phenomenon of games. Games is here, what should I think of? Poker, golf, Super Mario, Tetris, playing in the schoolyard?
Yes.
All of it?
For me, it makes no sense to distinguish too sharply or limit or exclude some types of games. So I would be happy to look at all the things that we would call games, because I don't think there can be sharp distinctions here. And perhaps if we try to make the sharp distinctions, then we will not be able to capture tomorrow's games, for instance. So
right.
So for me, it would include sports as well.
It would include sports.
Oh yes,
absolutely. Which also today are a digital activity, right? There is electronic sports.
Right.
But I'm not making a mistake by thinking of this primarily as computer games or board games?
I would not personally, I don't see the distinction between the digital and non-digital as very conducive to analytic research. I think it's a problem rather than a solution.
Yeah, that part I understand.
Right.
So I can see why a modern board game and a computer game are in some sense the same thing.
Yes.
But golf seems to be something different. But we can talk about. I don't understand what is. Certainly, some of modern computer games have some kind of story, which golf doesn't, or the story in golf is rather boring. The story in chess is always the same. That the king.
If there is a story in chess.
Yeah. If there's a story about kings in chess, and there is one in Macbeth. And there is one in video games, but the stories are different.
I would say that the concepts that you would apply to make that work analytically is very different. So whatever story might mean when we talk about chess would be very different from what the story might mean when we talk about Macbeth. Except that both have kings in them.
Yes.
But a king is not a story element.
See, that's exactly what I want to learn from you about, because I'm sure there are interesting concepts to be learned here, and there I guess we are in the part of game studies that emerges from literature studies or narratology or linguistics.
You could say that. Where game studies come from is also kind of hard to describe, but you could say that very many of the very early contributors were from literature. In fact, the first
contributors to the academic field, not to the construction of video games.
That is right. So I guess psychology was probably the first main contributor. And then you had a large influx from literary studies. This has to do with the fact that in the early days of computer games, there were a number of games that were textual. So the literary critics and literary theorists looked at these as a kind of literature, and therefore they went into it. But of course now we are talking.
So this text adventures in the 70s and 80s?
Yes, exactly. They were among the first computer games that captured the attention of humanists in particular, and so that's why
by virtue of being cultural artifacts,
by virtue of being textual,
by virtue of being textual,
and therefore literary in some sense, or at least potentially interesting as literature. Nobody saw the early adventure games as particularly interesting as literature, but they saw the potential that it could become so. And of course,
that would be true for literature as well. I guess the first literature was crap as well.
I don't think that is fair to say, but then again, maybe we don't know what the first literature was.
No, exactly, that's probably not preserved.
And it's gone, so who knows?
So before we go into that endlessly fascinating detail, so you mentioned psychology. So that would be the psychology of games as influencing human behavior? I would guess that this currently is something that captures a lot of attention, certainly in the media.
But already 35 years ago, psychologists were interested in games, and they wrote books about computer games. We're talking about, right? So they would find them interesting as mostly as perhaps ways to make children learn more efficiently, things like that.
Oh, the educational aspect.
Yes.
Is that another distinction? So a game is both a piece of entertainment, or killing time actually, but it can also be used or maybe misused as an educational activity? Is it still a game in your...
Yes, but again, if we don't limit ourselves to computer games, you could make the argument that schools, for instance, have always used games. In some sense. They have used them in physical education, they have used them in mathematics. You could say that it's a kind of a game to get the best grade.
So as soon as there's a competitive element,
right.
It's a game, it's gamified if you want?
Yeah.
So grades are a gamification of learning.
Exactly. So it's always been there. And therefore the idea that now we need more gamification in schools seems to me perhaps problematic. Perhaps we need less. Or perhaps it's okay what we have. So but this complicates it because now we're not necessarily talking about computer games anymore.
No.
And the question then becomes: is the computer gamification of schools a good thing, or is it not really an efficient thing? That's a whole discussion right there.
I have strong opinions on that.
I have too.
Okay, but let's not go there because maybe that's a different conversation.
Maybe it is.
But there is now also a psychological aspect about how people are influencing in how people's behavior is influenced by video gaming as a time-consuming activity.
Yes.
That's also certainly part of game studies broadly construed?
Well, it's actually maybe partly inside and partly outside, because if you look at what is typically called effect studies, so media effect studies, so what happens to people who consume certain types of media, that is a field which is not necessarily, I mean, the people who do this don't necessarily see themselves as game studies researchers. Probably most of them will not.
Because this is an older field that is already established?
Yes, exactly. This is a field
inside psychology,
it's
or
media psychology. Well, actually, there's media psychology, and then there's effect studies, and they might not even be the same either. So, and then you have media researchers who also comment on this or try to intervene in this kind of thinking. So that's a.
I happen to know that in the olden days, women were suggested to not read crime fiction while pregnant, because the idea was that if you read crime fiction while pregnant, then your child becomes a criminal.
Yeah, everybody knows that. Right?
Yes, everybody knows that. I think that's a claim that we have rejected by now.
I hope so.
But there are other claims about how this influences behavior.
That exactly.
Certainly take a lot of attention in the popular press.
Right. For instance, games with violence will make people violent is one hypothesis.
So my first reaction there, that just a simple time study analysis should falsify that, because 20 years ago nobody played violent video games, and today everybody, as a first approximation, plays violent video games, but violence has declined?
Well, violence,
or is this an overly naive way?
No, I think it's a fair assessment, but then again, there's a lot of factors involved in the notion that violence has declined. Which might be due to many other causes as well.
I see.
But certainly it can't be. I mean, certainly you can observe that fact, and then you can't really use it as an argument for the possibility that games make people violent. Certainly, it's an indication that there's a null hypothesis.
Okay.
It doesn't.
So I was being overly dramatic, but there's something there in that argument somewhere. I see.
I mean, but you could say also that the people who have tried to research violence in games and its effect haven't done it in a way which instills confidence in their method, and so it could still be possible, but when you look at what they've done, it's not very convincing.
But if I was a sociologist, I would be all over that. That seems to be a very large, important thing that is more or less easy to study. So the research is just not being done. There's a lot of moral panic and alarmism about this.
But sociologists are not too concerned with moral panic. That's the psychologists who are tapping into that interesting research opportunity, I guess. They are looking at media panics or they are not looking at media panics, but they're looking at media effects in a way that I don't think sociologists would do. I'm not a sociologist, so I shouldn't speak for them, but I believe there's a difference there. Media sociologists might look at these things and from a very different angle than the effects psychologists, and perhaps argue against it.
So this must also be part of economics now. I just read about a single study where we can see that I think this is an American study, I have to look it up. I think young American males are increasingly living at home and increasingly playing a large number of video games and increasingly not interacting with the labor market, so they're getting increasingly inefficient from an economist's point of view. And this is a trend that we see often and many times, but the interesting thing is now they are not unhappy. So there have been many periods of economic crisis where young males have basically not been able to get a job, stayed at home, and were terribly depressed because of this. Now they stay at home and play video games and are not terribly depressed. I'm unsure whether this is a good thing or a bad thing, and what the causality is here. Well, is the access to amazingly fascinating video games today contributing to the fact that these young men aren't getting a haircut and a job, or is it the other way around, that the economy today is no longer able to absorb large masses of men with low labor market skills, and hence they go to video games?
Well, it certainly is a good thing if fewer people are depressed. I mean, that cannot be argued with, I guess. And then you could say, are video games keeping people happier or keeping them at home unemployed? And I personally, I doubt that we can blame the current employment numbers on video games.
Unemployment numbers.
Right, well, both.
It's certainly not part of traditional Marxist theory to blame this on video games. No.
But and then again, you can also look at games as a happy means of killing time, as a fairly innocent means of killing time. That has always been there, right? I mean, if we went to prison, let's say we were put in a cell together, and no books, no TV, nothing, what could we possibly do to keep ourselves entertained?
Don't go there.
We would play a game, right?
I hope we would just play a game. Yes.
And a non-violent game, hopefully.
A non-violent game like chess or something serious, because we're academics.
Right. And that would keep our minds occupied. So we wouldn't, say if you were in a solitary cell, even worse, right? So you would be able to keep your mind occupied in a better way than if you were going crazy because you were in solitary.
Oh yeah, but I'm at least pretend to be a mathematician. So for me, being solitary in a cell would and somebody that's the dream for a mathematician.
Of course. And games would then help for the rest of us.
Yes. Yeah, but maybe mathematics is also just a game. So this was what? Sociology, psychology, maybe economics. There is a creative, constructive, computer sciencey part to game studies as well, or is that something else?
Well, yes, certainly there's game design.
Game design,
yes. And that is, and of course game development, I mean technology, right? So you have two very different things. One is game design and one is game technology. They often seem to be mixed, and of course they need to be mixed if you want to create a top-notch game these days.
One certainly needs to inform the other because
yes, but they're not the same. That's also important to
So just spell this out for me, pretend I don't know the difference.
Right. If you're a game designer, you design the systems which engage the players on a, you could say, functional level. Right?
So I decide that Mario can jump, but not fly unless he eats the right pill.
But you don't necessarily write the code to make Mario jump. So that is not necessarily the same thing. You could make a role-playing game just with pen and paper. You could write out all the rules, all the descriptions, everything, and then you hand it over to a programmer who would implement it.
So the game designer might as well, in some sense, design a board game. I mean, the design of the board, it's about finding the rules.
It's about engaging the players and making meaningful systems that makes interesting sense to the player. So it's like systematizing or systemic work rather than implementing the systems.
Whereas the game developer is, basically just a programmer. I say that with the greatest respect for programmers.
Absolutely.
I teach programmers. This is really hard.
And I have taught programming also in 30 years ago.
Yes.
So I know also something about programming. And yes, of course. But it's also about creating assets. It's about making user interfaces. It's about marketing. It's about understanding and getting access to intellectual property and handling that. So there's a lot of things that go into
development.
That's development and production, you could say, game production.
Which includes hiring actors or...
all kinds of things like that. And,
is this still under the umbrella of game studies, or would you?
No, certainly studying the industry is part of game studies. Definitely is.
Oh, studying the industry.
Yes, so you could say studying the markets, studying the public, the audiences, studying, there's something called studio studies, where people study what goes on in a game studio, for instance.
And that would be epistemologically comparable to studying the movie industry or the
the
publishing industry.
That's right.
Or journalism.
Right, or even sports, right? So what happens?
Or even sports.
Yeah, what happens? How do you keep a team together? That sort of thing, right? There's all kinds of interesting dynamics that you can study.
Oh, so that might not only be at a sociology school, but actually at a business school or something. I mean,
probably, yeah. I don't know, actually. But yeah. And of course, esports, right? So then definitely you have to apply, for instance, an ethnographic perspective.
So tell us about that, esports. That could mean two different things, unless I'm mistaken. But it could be me playing a game where I pretend to play football, and it could be me playing a non-sports game competitively.
Yes, or a sports game competitively.
But then, I was trying to find two examples that make the difference clear.
Yeah. So mostly when we talk about esports, we definitely talk about competitive sports, often team-based sports, not necessarily, but very often team-based competitive computer games that you play as though you were a sports person. So you play competitively, you are part of a team, it might be organized like any other sports team.
Can you put some names on this? I mean, I stopped playing video games many years ago, but...
you mean games, types of games. Well, I mean, a good old favorite is Counter-Strike. Right? So that would be an obvious
first-person shooter where you go around
team-based shooter, where you play two teams play against each other.
3D environment.
Yeah. And one team wins, and the other loses. And then of course you have more, and that's of course cops and anti-cops or terrorists. You have other kinds of games. You have games like FIFA that can be used. That's a football.
That's
football
one
game.
person against one person, or not? Am I wrong?
Yes, that's right. So you can play that. You can play.
Which is just for our audience who does not spend their entire time playing video
football
games.
Simulation.
It's a football simulation. Yes.
Yeah. And so, but any game could be used, of course. But interestingly, these games are usually popular among audiences. So you want games that have an interesting visual appearance. Not necessarily for the sake of the players, but for the sake of making it an interesting experience for people who watch it. So that's an important factor.
I wonder what the parameters are there. So that is esports as soon as it's as a competitive video gaming is esports.
Yes, and it's becoming more and more important, more and more commercial. The prices are higher and higher. You can
sponsors this.
Yeah,
I'm just curious.
I'm not an expert in esports. I have colleagues who know all these things. I'm pretty sure that it's sponsored by. The usual suspects, technology companies.
Okay, so it's a sociological phenomenon, just like soccer is normally, and you can study that just like you can study soccer.
Very much so. You can study what. We had a great thesis dissertation coming out of here. Emma Witkowski wrote about. She was studying the players and how they. Cast themselves in the roles of sports athletes in a certain sense, right? They would have sponsored clothes. They would.
The physical players themselves, the actual human beings.
Yes. They would basically be, if they're on a high enough level and successful enough, they are stars. They are sports stars. People look up to them. People admire them, and they are hopefully well paid. And some of them become very rich people.
In that little bubble.
It's not a small bubble.
Oh no. I mean, I have children. They told me about mysterious phenomena like Pewdiepie, who I never heard of, but who seems to be one of the most
a different phenomenon, which is
on the planet. Yes.
No, Pewdiepie is an interesting, very different, but still very interesting phenomenon.
Oh, because he played games as well originally. Yeah, talk about that.
Pewdiepie is the most successful YouTuber ever. He has I think now it's up to 54 million subscribers, which is
more than there are people in South Korea.
Probably, and not only that, but so he's the most successful YouTuber ever. So YouTube is a huge phenomenon, as you know, right? And the most successful YouTuber is a game player, and there are many of those, but he's the most successful, and he's, I don't know how many more subscribers he has than the next one on that list, but you know, there's a lot of them. To compare, I think BBC has maybe 5 million subscribers, right? And a similar difference in terms of how many views the videos have generated.
So what would PewDiePie do? I've never watched a full PewDiePie video.
PewDiePie is a game critic, or was a game critic. He's branched out into various kinds of almost reality TV-like entertainment. But he plays games and he responds to games in his videos on a very visceral and fairly primordial level. So he responds
while playing the game.
While playing
so when I, as a YouTube consumer, watch a PewDiePie video, I watch him playing the game.
Yep.
I see the screen and him,
yes.
or hear him.
Yes, you see a little. Maybe you see a little head of his as he is playing the game as well. And he, of course, is, to my mind, the most influential video game critic, computer game critic ever.
Because he talks about the game while he plays it.
Because he showcases the games by playing them, and then if you say are a game developer, a game designer, and he plays your game, you're made. You're basically a hit because he has put the spotlight on your game.
Unless he takes a dump on the game.
Yeah, but he tends not to do that actually. So he is like our time's most successful critic, like an influential critic, like in the art world Ruskin was in the 19th century, right? So if Ruskin wrote about your painting, you would be famous. And PewDiePie has the same kind of effect. If he plays your game, you are also getting a lot of attention. That means sales. That means success. Uh-huh. So he is so much more influential than any other game critic who just writes a normal critical essay.
So if I spend a few hours at the computer, why would I want to watch PewDiePie play Legend of Zelda instead of playing it myself?
Because he's quite entertaining. I mean, he's like you either love him or you hate him kind of thing. So he is fake. Childish in a way. So he creates a persona that is very iconic, very easy to be engaged by, and in that sense.
So the experience is more like me going over to a friend's and watching him or her play the game and interacting with them, and that's almost as good as playing it myself. In particular, if I don't really have time to.
Right.
Time to learn the game.
Right. In general, when you watch people play, you learn a lot in a very fast time because they already know the game, so they can show you how it's done. If you're sitting there with a whole new game, it takes a long time perhaps to get. If it's complicated enough, it will take you a long time to get into it. So you save a lot of time by watching.
I heard somebody who said he likes video games, he just can't invest the time of learning the game for 16 hours to play it, but he actually wants to know what happens. Seeing somebody else walk through the game and commenting on it is a good waste of time.
It might be very useful, especially if you're a game researcher like me.
Oh, for you it's perfect, yes, but then the audience would not be 54 million because you're not that many, right? This is an emerging field which exists at ITU. It has always been a big thing at ITU.
Yes, it has.
It's built into the DNA, I guess, of ITU. Talk a bit about that. You have a research project now.
Well, I mean, the field is one thing, and what we do at ITU is related, but of course a separate thing. There has been research at ITU since the start. In 1999, we got the first PhD in games, Lisbeth Krastrup, who then defended her thesis in 2003. So, and this is at the very earliest years of ITU. So there has been an ongoing games research here from the very start. I mean, Anke Helms-Jørgensen was associate professor here, and he, together with ITU management, saw the potential of games research at the very early stage. And therefore, ITU has played a very important role in the field because it was here before it was a field. You could argue that. Well, you could argue what a field is, but to me, it has to have some sort of organized activities. It's not enough that somebody is writing something. It has to be organized as a sociological phenomenon, if you will.
In the research community,
Yes,
there have to
exactly.
be conferences, journals.
Yeah, so you build a community and then you have a field,
Yes.
or that those two things
Yes.
go hand in hand. And so ITU had the first international computer games conference here in, I think it was March 2001, which is, very, very early. And then the same year we created and launched the first peer-reviewed research journal, Game Studies.
Which you were an editor of?
I was the editor-in-chief.
Yeah, you were the editor-in-chief.
And still am.
Oh, I see.
After 17 years. So I should stop soon. And we launched it internationally. I was then in Bergen, so that's where the server was. But when I got here in 2003, I brought the journal here as well. So it's been here since then.
So we have the journal, we have activities of you and other affiliated researchers. There's an education program as well?
Yes. So ITU started its game education in 2005. So that's been now 12 years. Other places have had educations longer. There has been classes. I was teaching games-related classes in 1993. So it's been going on for a while, but of course steadily more institutionalized, more stable perhaps, more of a field where people can relate to what other people are doing elsewhere in the world. And now we see more and more countries having their own programs, establishing their own research centers and things like that. We also, very importantly, this year in Finland, we got a center of excellence, a national center of excellence for game culture studies. So that's a first in our field, and so I would say it's going quite well, at least these days.
It must be super exciting.
Well, it's also a lot of work.
But that's why we're here, right?
Well, you could say that science as ordinary business isn't that exciting, and there are benefits of that. When you're creating a field or trying to create a field, there's a lot of extra work.
There's a lot
of tensions, a lot of stress
you
don't have when when you're in a very old field like computer science.
Yeah.
Then you don't have that anymore. I'm sure.
An old field like computer science,
Right.
which is from the late 60s,
Right.
early 70s.
So this is from the late 90s, you could say.
Yeah, I'm already a dinosaur.
Well, not you, but your field.
Well, my subfield is very different, right? Because my subfield is a very narrow discipline.
Right,
It doesn't
right.
care about the domain.
Right.
Whereas game studies, I guess, is a domain that unites a lot of disciplines.
That is correct.
And
That is
disciplines are normally where the tensions are. So I could imagine there are extremely exciting
There are
discussions
different-
about what a good PhD thesis is.
There are different tensions in disciplines and fields, right? So in the field, the tension would be between the disciplines. So
Yes.
when I as a humanist talk to a sociologist, are we talking about the same thing? Probably not. And if we don't realize that, then we're in trouble.
Well, you might talk about the same domain, right? But you would not necessarily agree on what a truth claim is, how that is evaluated, what good research is, what relevance is, and so on.
Right. If we are talking about the same domain or the same phenomenon, then that might be a problem. But the earlier problem is if we don't even realize that we're not talking about the same thing.
Yes.
So when I'm talking about a game, I could be talking about an object, something that you put on the table, something that you study as a kind of a text, right? An artifact. When a sociologist talks about a game, they talk about a human process, a social process perhaps, that's something, an activity.
Playing the game.
Yeah, right?
So now we are really getting close to the ontology of what a game is, right? Where you have speak with some authority. Before getting there, let's just get game theory out of the way, right? Because that also exists, and that is actually a field that is, I kid you not, even older than computer science, right? Game theory is discovered by John von Neumann in, I'm lying, I guess the 40s.
Yes,
There's a famous, audiences might know the movie with John Nash, A Beautiful Mind, which is the best popularization of game theory, which received a Nobel, again, I have to be careful, it's not a Nobel Prize, it's the economics prize the economics medal in honor of Alfred Nobel, often called the Nobel Prize in Economics.
Wow.
Yeah. We don't care.
Right.
And that's something else, right?
Yeah,
Game theory.
and of course we're very envious for those two reasons, right? You could get a Nobel something, and they stole the notion of game theory, which to me, game theory, mathematical, economical game theory, is about competitive situations and about knowledge about a competitive situation.
Yeah.
How do you, if you don't have full knowledge of what's going on, what is your best strategy? That sort of thing.
That's exactly what it is, right?
Right.
It's a mathematical model for competitive behavior
Yeah.
in settings where you either share some knowledge or don't share knowledge. There are famous examples like the prisoner's dilemma, which belong to game theory. But it's a branch of math, it's a branch of economics, and interestingly, it's also a branch of computer science today because, and highly useful in Google's auction system for hiring out ad space uses really cool game theory.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's a much more general solution to a much more general problem, you could say. It doesn't mean that it's not totally
nice.
uninteresting for study of entertainment games, but it hasn't played a large role. Some few people have tried to look at it. I wouldn't say they have been unsuccessful, but there's not a lot of applications so far.
Certainly for the cultural aspect, but I would guess there is a deep, very narrowly in artificial intelligence for video games, there may be actually game theoretic arguments.
I don't know.
Being used.
It could well be. And also, if you are a team, let's say you're organizing an esport team, and you need to know what are the others going to do, then there are probably many applications there.
Maybe tournament design, that's game theory.
Maybe also if we play Monopoly, and I really want to beat
but
you.
I would never play. I'm a good enough board gamer that I would never play Monopoly. That would be a terrible idea because it's a terrible game. That's the one thing we should get out of the conversation.
Well,
don't play Monopoly.
Okay, chess then.
Chess, much better, yes.
Although in chess you have total information.
Total information,
right?
yes.
So in that sense, maybe it's not so useful.
The first conversation on this podcast with Troels Bjerlund, who is our resident game theorist, that was about game theory of poker, and we talked a bit about chess as well.
Right.
I just wanted to have these concepts out of the way because I think people are excused by confusing game theory with game studies.
Yeah, they should not.
Yeah, they should.
It's as simple as that. It's not the same thing.
It's not the same thing.
No.
Right. Cultural studies. So now the ontology of game. So you and ontology. Pretend I don't know what ontology is. What's the ontology of this table?
Oh yeah. So ontology is basically theories about what is. How are things what they are, and how do they? I mean, you could say ontology is at least three different things. It's the bigger questions of existence. What does it mean that something exists? It is of course a specific theory about how things exist. And then you could say, when I talk about ontology, I'm more inspired by computer science and the idea of mapping a domain. So when you implement something, you need a model of what that domain is, right? And that is what I try to do with games. I try to map the domain of games. What are the essential components and their relations in this domain? So when I talk, but of course I could also talk about it in a more existential way. What does it mean to play a game? What is a game deep down, essentially? Right, so that would be another application. So I distinguish between formal ontology and existential ontology of games. I'm interested in both, but
which is which? Or could you give an example that makes it clear what the difference is?
Right. So if I'm playing a game and there is an object in that game, let's say
chess piece.
Yeah. Or let's use a more non-physical example. So let's say there is a sword in a fantasy game. Right. So what is the nature of that sword? That would be a sort of existential question, ontological question. What is the nature of a sword in a game? Is it real, but not physical? Is it perhaps fictional, since it's not physical, or what is it? So that would be an example of an existential question.
So how can it not be fictional? What would be the difference between the Sword of Might in Zelda and Narsil in The Lord of the Rings?
Right. So one is something that you read about in a story, and you can only read about it. You cannot do anything to it. You know that Narsil has no equivalent in the real world. There is no narsil anywhere. It's an empty signifier in a certain sense, or a signifier of that points to a fiction, that points to something that does not exist. When you see and use a sword in a game, it is an object that is, in a sense, it belongs to you personally. It is not, I mean, if we play a game and you have a sword, I don't have that sword. And so you have a very different relationship to that object than I do, even if we play the same game.
Because it helps me do thing in the game?
It is, you could even sell it, right? If it's that sort of...
I can sell it in World of Warcraft.
You cannot sell narsil.
I cannot sell. I can buy the replica of narsil at the local nerd shop, but that's something completely different.
That is something completely different. Right?
Then the signifier actually signifies a physical object in real reality.
Right, it would be a real object. I mean, a physical
of which
object.
there are only 8,000.
A physical object. So here's the interesting question that games helps us see: are things that are not physical not real? Right. So just because it's not physical, does that mean it's not real? Or what does it mean? So I mean, and we can translate this into other areas. For instance, Bitcoin, right? Is a Bitcoin real?
Oh, very
it's
nice.
Not physical.
Okay. So let me try this. So Bitcoin generates reality in the sense that owning this completely unphysical thing allows me to buy stuff, which is just a social convention between me and the other Bitcoin users. And if I acquire the sort of might in some video game that I can use to beat you up, it also enables something, even though that all still just happens in virtual reality or in a fictional setting. Am I using those words right?
We don't have to use them. We could just talk about information objects, right? They're information objects of some sense. Now the interesting question is, when I do this, look. Here is a Danish 50 kroner.
Okay, you have now a physical 50
kroner
in your hand.
I have an object. So why is this different from Bitcoin? Or is it? Right. There's something about this that is not just physical either.
Or the money I generated in a video game, where I also can acquire credit.
Right. And you can work in a video game and you can translate the video game money to your national currency of choice.
And why is this different from fiction? Just spell this out for me.
Well, right, because when you have fictional money, or when you read about
money,
there's nothing you can do about it. I mean, you cannot earn the money, you cannot sell. You cannot use that money. The only people who can use fictional money is fictional characters.
Okay. So, and it's not important here whether it's a digital video game or a board game where I have small chits of wood or paper.
Or a casino.
A casino.
Right. So here we have...
or the terrible money in the terrible game Monopoly, which people should not play at home.
Right. So there's a certain difference here, and that is, of course, that the length of the game span. So in Monopoly, you play for maybe 2 hours or something like that, and during that time, the money acquires some sort of value related to the gaming situation. Nobody would sell Monopoly money on the street for anything like its in-game value. But you can do that when the game is persistent, when it and like Bitcoin, right? When there is a system that maintains the currency over time, then you can do that.
I understand.
And then of course the question is, what about single player games? What about games where you have some sort of money system which helps you in the game, but it doesn't really help you out of the game? What then? What then is the nature of that? Right.
Are we sure there is here? Are we sure these are questions that actually have answers? Are we sure that the question, what is the ontology of money?
Isn't that what the research is all about?
It's what research is about, yes. So we mentioned fiction here. So games seem to differ a lot in what kind of narrative structure they have. There should be games like Tetris or chess in one extreme.
It's complicated. I mean, so do games have a narrative structure, or what kind of structure do they have, and are all games the same? All right. So some things that we call games are in reality hybrids between storytelling and gameplay. And therefore, they are not truly just games either. They are something else. They are in a sense, a combination of different modalities, storytelling and gameplay. And of course, if they can manage to integrate them well, then they're successful. But that doesn't mean that storytelling is gameplay, if you see what I mean.
I think I'm getting that, right?
Yeah.
Because it seems to me also naively, at least, that computer games are more or are potentially more of a narration than an old-fashioned game like golf or poker or chess, right? I mean, I have to work very hard to pretend chess to be an exciting story.
Well,
but there are a lot of modern video games that are basically me following somebody else's script. I guess I don't play enough to be able to point to one, but I would guess there are games where I basically just follow a script, and it's a slightly more immersive environment than watching the movie, because there's some interactivity, perhaps. Or reading the book.
Perhaps. I mean, immersion is another one of those words that are not very clear, and they can mean many different things. But let's stick to gameplay and story. So if you experience somebody's story when you're playing a game, that is, of course, not just a game. That is also storytelling in the game. So you have an integration of both these two phenomena in the same software package, if you will. So since computer games are essentially software packages with assets.
What's an asset?
An asset would be a graphic, a sound, perhaps a 3D model of something. So basically, you could say the scenography, the decorations, all those things. So then, if you have a game, if you have a piece of software that contains assets and of course also storytelling and gameplay, then it is not just a game. It is also a storytelling device that happens to have a game in it, if you will.
Yes.
So
then I sort of understand why the established models or theories or ontologies of literature theory or literary theory are useful for understanding.
They're
games.
useful and problematic at the same time, right? So because if you then confuse software with both games and stories in it, with software which just has a potential for action, so basically what we call a game, that's not the same thing. Right?
I can see why a game like Minecraft is a really bad story, or it's
what's the story?
Create
There's
the
no story. Yeah. So that's another complication. So when you experience something, do you then create a story? And I would say not necessarily.
I guess when I buy a book, I have some kind of convention with the author that he or she tells me the story.
Yeah, and then you experience the story, and then you can tell me another story based on that story, right? Or you can retell the story.
But still, the author has a lot of power. I can't.
Oh, yeah.
No matter how I read the Bible, Jesus is probably still going to be nailed to a cross at the end.
I suppose so.
Unless I skip that part, I guess.
Or
I could skip that part.
Or if you find an apocryphal version, which it doesn't happen, right? So.
Right, but if I read Harry Potter, then
yes.
Okay, I didn't never finish that. I have no idea how it ends actually, but yeah. If I read The Lord of the Rings, the ring is going to be thrown into Mount Doom.
Yes.
And I can't really do much about that. But there was a period in the 80s or 90s where you actually had these books where you built your own adventure.
That's right. That's right. They were.
I played those as a kid.
Yeah. I have two of them. I use them as examples. But the interesting.
Just tell us about just to be sure.
So
what this is.
Okay. So they're called Choose Your Own Adventure books. Right?
Choose Your Own Adventure. Yes.
And basically they're like a hypertext where you sort of follow the links, but the links, of course, are page numbers. So if you you're in front of a building, there is a storm blowing. Do you go into the building or do you continue down the road? Choose to go to page 1 if you want to go inside the building, that sort of thing, right?
And then I continue reading at page 19 because I chose to pick up the sword or kill the dragon.
Yeah, and then there are lots of endings where you die, like a game. But interestingly, these books seem to have appeared after the first adventure games in the mid 70s. So here's a book genre that was inspired by a game genre. Or a computer game genre.
The book genre died, didn't it?
Well, I guess
because now we have video games that do this much better.
Probably at some point it was cheaper just to buy the kids a game than a book. Maybe I don't know. Could have been that, you know, depending. I don't know. I can't remember the prices of these things, but yeah, they were also limited, right? So they were quite simple.
But I had, at least as a reader, I had some control over what happened to my character.
Some control, yes, but not a lot of control.
I followed a branching set of stories.
Exactly. And then are you now in charge of anything, or are you just choosing between alternatives?
I don't know.
Right. And
tell me.
Well, I mean, there are probably simple mathematical models for how much you are in charge. I haven't seen those.
Mathematics of existentialism. I just need to know the entropy of the tree,
or the design, or the sort of a possibility space, right? There's a possibility space, and it's very limited. In a computer game, say a 3D computer game, you have a lot larger possibility space of movement, of action. In Minecraft, you have enormous, extreme level of freedom, if you will.
And there's no goal, right? I can do what I want, or is there a goal? I've never played Minecraft enough.
I mean, depends on what you mean by goal. You set your own goals.
Can I win it?
No, I don't think it's possible to win Minecraft. I mean, it depends on whether you think about winning against other players. It's also a multiplayer game, so you can always destroy other people's buildings, and maybe that's winning for some people, right? So in a certain sense, you can have competitions inside it. You could have the competition for the best building or something like that. But it's not really, and this is interesting, right? So do games have to have winners and losers to be games? And I would say probably not. And Minecraft would be a good example of why it's not necessary. We do tend to think of Minecraft as a game, rightly or wrongly, but it doesn't have a win condition.
So games are entertainment? I'm trying.
I'm
not sure.
I'm a games associate. I don't know what a game is.
Ah, yes. That's why we're here.
I mean, it's like a biologist who doesn't know what life is. Of course they don't.
They don't know what life is. So computer games are often single-player games today, right? More than they used to be before there were computer games. Is this true?
You mean games?
Games.
Right.
Yes.
Well,
yes.
Clearly, again, it depends on what you mean by single-player game, because you can always play a game with other people. We can play single-player games together, right?
Absolutely.
And in fact, that was one of my earliest experiences with adventure games. A friend of mine across town had the Hobbit on the Commodore 64.
Oh, I played on the Spectrum. Interesting.
Right, there you go.
Yes,
I didn't have
terrible to get back through Mirkwood. I never, Probably, I remember that, yes. Yep. Gandalf picks up some lunch. Or
and Thorin sits down and sings about gold.
Starts singing about gold, yes. Oh, very nice.
Right, so I found that game extremely intriguing, but I didn't have a Commodore 64, I didn't even have a Spectrum. I had a BBC, the Acorn Electron, for which there was no version of the Hobbit.
Oh, very sad.
I know, and so what I did was, this was Christmas time, and the weather in Bergen was quite bad. So
As it always is?
Yeah, more or less. Not in May and June, or half of June. But most of the time. And so what I did was, instead of traveling halfway through town, I just picked up the phone and I called my friend who had the game, and we played it together. And he told me what happened, and I would help giving instructions and so on. So here was a video game that I played over the phone.
See?
So is this still a video game?
Today we play all those games over the phone, but the phone has become much better. Yes.
Oh, you mean the internet?
Yes, we mean the internet.
Right,
yes.
right. But this was sort of play by voice, so to speak.
Yes. You're old enough to remember a time before the internet.
Yes, I am. Yes. Yeah. Although it's a good question though, because I visited my uncle at Cambridge, and they had network computers in the 70s. So who knows?
Yeah, who knows? So. I want to learn a bit more about sort of the concepts that you associate with games. And I understand that you're not really happy with how perfect these concepts map to game reality or game fictional reality. But I mean, what is these ideas of say fictionality to what extent am I, as a player, the author of the story, and to what extent am I not? And
well, I mean, the question again. This now becomes a question: what do you mean by story?
Yes.
So do you mean experience that you have when you play a game, Or do you mean a story as in somebody is trying to tell you a story here because they clearly have mapped out your routes and you're supposed to follow it and maybe resist it, but in the end you are getting from A to B.
Yeah, talk about the resistance, because that's an interesting thing.
Obviously when you want to have an interesting experience and somebody wants to give you an interesting experience, there might be a conflict there, because the interesting experience you want, your goals, might not overlap with the designer's goals. And what do you do then, and what does the designer do then, right? So it's in a sense there's your game theory, right? There's a conflict and of course not complete information. But in terms of story, let's say.
But why would I not want to follow the game? What is
not the game, but whatever somebody planned for you in that space.
The character and the story that I'm supposed to submit to.
Yeah, why would you do that?
I don't know.
As a game player, when you play a game, you want to be in control of the game, or most people do, right? Let's assume that's the standard. There are probably other modes that we don't need to talk about. But as a game player, you want perhaps to win. You want perhaps to rise to the challenge. You want to perhaps also do interesting things that you are curious about. And then the question is, what does the game offer you? But do the game designer also want to tell you a story here, right?
My stance as a player seems to be different when I play golf than when I play a video game, right? Because when I play physical golf, I don't think it's interesting to take the golf ball and walk to the hole and put it in there, because that's clearly cheating, even though the physical infrastructure allows me to do this.
But when you play a video game, you don't mind about cheating?
It seems to be that when I play a video game, it sort of becomes fun to see how I can cheat the game.
Right.
There's a strange glitch that I can exploit, or I actually know a code that I have to type.
Exactly. So that becomes.
Why do people behave differently here?
I mean, basically golf is a very simple system, and the system is basically gravity and physics, right? And you cannot really cheat it anyway. But a game system is a complex. I don't know. System where there might be interesting possibilities that nobody has found out yet, right? And so you can discover things when you play a game that perhaps nobody's done before, and that becomes an interesting success story, if you will. So I remember I played a game where I could, by standing still in front of a obelisk that generated skeletons, I could just, because I had the right gear, the skeletons would attack me but die and leave gold. And
with you doing nothing?
I was eating dinner or something, right? So when I got back to the game, there would be a huge amount of gold in front of me, because I had managed to figure out what is the best combination, or very good combination of some type of gear for my avatar that would kill the skeletons automatically. And they would keep coming because I was close to this obelisk that would produce them. And so either the game had crashed when I got back, or I was very rich and also had gained more experience. So that was for me a wonderful moment where I figure out through hard work how to beat the game in a certain sense.
Yeah, but in some sense by cheating, right?
Well, I wouldn't call it cheating. Because who did I cheat? I mean, it's a single. Can you cheat in single-player games?
That's what I don't know.
That's probably not.
Well, if I read a crime novel, I try to not read the last page, because that tells me who.
Right. But then you're probably only cheating yourself, right?
Yeah.
But there's a very big distinction between just looking at the last page and actually creating or inventing a system, a strategy within the system.
Yeah.
So those are very different, at least for me.
So you mentioned avatar here, which is another thing where I would assume there is a richer concept of self or character than there is in standard literary theory.
It's a very different thing. You could say a character is very different from an avatar. We confuse them often, because when you are playing a game which is where you have an avatar, they often also are characters. Not necessarily, but in many types of games, especially the sort of story game hybrids, you definitely are playing with an avatar that also represents somebody else, the main character.
Because some choices are constrained, or?
Well, that depends on what the game thing does, but perhaps yes. But you could define an avatar very simply as the in-game vehicle that you are represented by, right? And that is not a character. That's just an empty shell. You could say we possess these pseudo-physical things, but that doesn't make them characters, unless you want to perhaps also role-play as a character, which is a different thing again.
Oh yes, so you mean by intentionally doing things that are non-optimal in order to
imbue
the avatar with personality.
Or not something that is just basically what you would have done, but so if you want...
What I think that Pac-Man, okay, I can make Pac-Man more interesting by pretending that my Pac-Man is actually very scared of the pink ghost.
Yeah, but not the others.
And not the others, and tries to avoid them at all times. So never.
Yeah. You can also role-play a very bad Tetris player. That's very simple.
Oh yes, yes. Excellent.
But if you just played, you might not want to do that, right? If you just wanted to play Tetris in the ordinary way, you probably wouldn't want to do that. So you can role-play anything. I can even role-play sitting here talking to you.
Yes, yes. No, I've played a lot of pen and paper fantasy role-plays.
Right,
so
right.
That's
probably more than me then.
Absolutely my favorite genre. Right. Okay. I promised myself to not let you go before you explain to me what a ludeme is, because I like memes, and I found this word in preparing this. I need to understand it.
Okay, well, it's perhaps not easily understood, and perhaps we already talked about it, because...
Test me.
Well, I mean, if you think about what we talked about with money, right, or in-game objects that are not fictions, but still not physical. So how do we understand them? How do we make sense of them? And how do we distinguish them from, say, things like fiction? So, and it doesn't have necessarily to do with the computer games either. For instance, when you play chess on a board, there are chess pieces. What do they represent? What is the thing that, so the chess king, what does the chess king physically, the token on the board, what does it represent? It does not represent an algorithm, right?
No, it represents states of a rule system?
No, it's not necessarily that either. You could say that the setting of the board will represent the state of the game, but the piece itself, what does that represent? And one explanation for that is, well, it's an in-game entity that we could call sort of a game unit, or as you know, a grapheme or a phoneme. It's a ludeme. It's a ludic entity.
Oh, I see. So it's more like a phoneme than like a meme.
It's a separable unit of meaning in the game. The question is, are we then talking about something exclusive to games, or are we talking about things like Bitcoin as well? Right, or even money, right?
So some of the concepts of computer games, or let's call them memes of computer games, they have traveled back into normal life. Like we talk about leveling up our skills in math, or
but then of course the question is, does it come from games, or does it come from, say, the military or something like that, right? You level up as you become higher rank, or in the university. Come on.
Okay, good.
So that's also a question: where does these things come from, and where do they go? But the question I have about ludemes is there something that we can claim belongs to or can be understood only in terms of games, or is the chess king that is represented by the piece but is not the piece? Because if you burn the piece, you can still play the same game on, right? So
how delightfully complicated. So let me see if I get this right.
I mean,
I could play chess just by talking to you.
Yes,
if we were sufficiently good players, we could just talk.
I'm not, but you might be.
I'm not either.
So C4 to B1? No, that doesn't make sense.
Maybe, but something like that might make sense.
Right. And then we are still thinking in terms of these chess pieces, except that they're not physical anymore.
Oh, but we have.
But what are they?
Help me now. My semiotics really sucks. We now have a signifier that points to
an object within a system. So there is a closed system that we call chess, and in that system there are 32 pieces, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah. And each of them are distinguishable, but not physical, right? But that doesn't mean that they're definitely not fictional, right? They are just conceptual in a certain sense. They're conceptual objects.
We are manipulating some shared set of concepts about what a chess game is. We might have a physical board where we have a physical piece of wood that represents the position of the king.
But that's not the game.
that's not the game.
That's just a memory aid for us.
That's a memory aid for us. It might actually be pixels on a computer screen, or if we are sufficiently good, we would just talk about it and keep the entire state in our brain.
Blind chess.
So, and if I try to then project that on all computer games, so the question you want to answer is what the Ludim represents?
I mean, how do we, in terms of cognitive, in terms of how the brain works, is this phenomenon part of a larger phenomenon, or is it just something we find in games? And I tend to believe it must be more general than just game related. And
our desire to affix meaning to certain
abstract or not necessarily abstract, but non-physical. But yet real phenomena. I mean, a parallel would be numbers. So the number one.
Yeah.
So that's also one of those entities that we definitely believe it exists. But what sort of existence is it, right? Where does number one reside? When you put the number one on a piece of paper, it doesn't suddenly appear, right? And when you burn the paper, it's still there. So maybe that is the class of objects that we're talking about.
There is a Platonic ideal of video games out there, and our games are just mere shadows of these perfect games.
Or when we have when we experience something in our reality, why would we only relate it or reduce it to physical entities? I mean, even concepts like friendship, right? So where do you that we wouldn't assume that friendship does not exist just because it's not physical, if you will.
Oh, and that's actually represented in some of. The only game I'm playing right now is Legend of Zelda, where my friendship with my horse actually has a physical representation. I can see that because there's some meter that tells me how many carrots I've given to my horse, and then it's slightly happier to be ridden by me.
Right. So there is an entity that is, in a sense, residing in the game engine, if you will, right? Mm-hmm. And you are presented with an image on the screen that represents this entity in the system. Uh-huh. So there is also where it is. So if somebody managed to remove that entity from the machine, then it would also be gone from your reality.
Okay, but is the game then the system of rules, or am I simply
Well, it's a mechanism. I wouldn't call it rules. I would say it's as you know, computers are not necessarily rules systems. They're machines, right?
Yeah.
They don't follow rules. They just do what a machine does, for better or worse. So somewhere in there is a system which we can then observe from the outside via whatever the interface device is, a screen or sound or some other thing like pieces on a chessboard. But the system, is it Platonic or is it just conceptual?
I don't know.
I mean, we don't have to believe that these things exist independent of us to believe that they exist in a way that we relate to in a non-fictional way. It might be what William Gibson, the cyberpunk author, would call a consensual hallucination. But then
that's a great concept.
Right, but then
is that in Neuromancer or where is this?
Yeah, I believe it is. Yes.
William Gibson.
Yes. Mm-hmm. No. But I don't know if but then you could call mathematics a consensual hallucination.
Oh, I would be happy.
But the question is it a hallucination or is it just a very robust convention that? If you ignore it, it doesn't go away, as Philip Dick would say about what is reality, right? That which, when you stop believing it, it doesn't go away. So I don't believe in number one anymore. Well,
but I still do, and yes.
Yeah. So it's not really a hallucination. It's something else again.
Okay. Fine.
Maybe great. Language would also be an example of that, right? So we definitely don't deny the existence of words, even though we might disagree on what they mean.
And so great. So to tie this up, then games and video games in particular are certainly part of reality now.
Yeah. And, to a very large extent.
To a very large extent.
Everybody plays them almost. If you don't play games, you're probably not normal, unfortunately.
Just one closing question. I guess literary studies, at least traditionally, focused on the highlights of the genre in some sense. This may not be true anymore because it has become cultural studies, and there's probably just as much written about Harry Potter as about War and Peace, but there has been, at least traditionally, some kind of ennobling.
Oh yes, and of course this comes from the study of the Bible, which started it all as a science, right? So you have exegesis.
It's exegesis first,
right? And then literary,
so.
and then suddenly people started using those tools on things that were not religious texts, and of course, but still with the ideology of this is a great text.
Right, but not. But I guess the point I want to make is that not all texts are great, and I read quite broadly, and there are certainly some books that I can see would survive a critical approach, or actually that sort of mandate, or at least where it makes sense to think of them as cultural artifacts, try to find an interpretation. And there are other books, which I also read a lot of, where it would be a complete waste of time and just would be a joke in order to try to seriously study that book.
Well, or at least if you study it, there must be another reason for it.
There must be another reason than the contents. The book itself has no ambition of being interpreted that way.
No, probably not. Or maybe it has, but it failed.
Oh, but it fails, yes. It's the same, what should we call this, snobism or elitism, something that emerges in video games as well?
Of course.
Are there games by now that are classics?
Yes, and you know, like it or dislike it, I'm not particularly interested in creating a canon of great games. I don't think that's my job. I mean, that's the job of the critic, not the theorist.
This is the job of Pewdiepie.
You know, or people. Maybe also it's the job of game historians who want to see how games evolve, how they influence each other, where do certain phenomena start and stop. Again, not necessarily the same thing as creating a classic canon. But to me, games are not just works of art. They are also, in a sense, technological systems. And so for me it becomes interesting to see what are the achievements of game history in terms of its conceptual technology. For instance, the most important computer game of all time, you have played it, it's Dungeons and Dragons.
The pen and paper game?
Yes, because it has influenced almost every computer game genre after in these years. I mean, the role-playing, leveling up, you know, team-based, collaborative play.
Strong narrative element where you still have some freedom.
You know, experiencing a certain quest structure, things like that, right? So this is a game which, or a game system perhaps, D20, whatever you want to call it, that has launched 1,000 games. And so it must be super important, but it's technically not a computer game, but who cares?
Excellent. So if we're done, then we can just round it off, telling people to go home and play more pen and paper based role-playing games.
At least know your game history and study it.
Know your game history. Espen, thanks a lot for coming, and thank you all for listening. Bye.
My pleasure.